Some cases, they really stick with you. And it's not just the darkness of the crimes themselves. It's when you start to see the whole web of failures that let those things happen, the things that allowed it to go on. And the one we're looking at today, Gilberto Chamba, gosh, the monster of two continents, that's one of those cases.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's a stark example, really, when you think about it, how the systems, right, within countries and between countries, how those weaknesses can have just devastating consequences. And what we're doing here in this deep dive, it's not just about recounting the awful things that happened, but really trying to understand how these breakdowns happened, how a violent offender could escape justice, not just once, but across two continents.
You got it. And that's exactly what we're aiming for today, looking at all this material you brought together about Chamba. How did he slip through the cracks? And crucially, what can we learn from this whole awful story? So we're going to follow his path, right? Starting with his early life, the first crimes in Ecuador, then his capture, and the fact that he was released so early, just unbelievable. And then, of course, his move to Spain and the violence that continued there.
And what you'll see, I think, as we go through this timeline together is a recurring pattern, missed opportunities, communication breakdowns, things just being overlooked.
Mhm.
It's about understanding not just what happened, but the why behind these systemic failures.
Okay, so let's start unpacking this for you, right back at the beginning. Gilberto Antonio Chamba Suarez. He was born back in the 1960s in Machala, Ecuador. It's a coastal city. You might know it for its banana exports.
Yeah.
And one thing that struck me going through the early material was that, when you think about someone who commits such horrific acts, his early life, it seemed pretty stable.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Our sources suggest, a relatively stable upbringing. And that throws a wrench in things, right? Because it makes those simple explanations we might try to come up with about, where this kind of violence comes from, it complicates those. It reminds us that this kind of behavior, it can be complex. It's not always a clear-cut thing coming from someone's early life.
But even in those early years, there were some signs, weren't there? If you read what his former classmates said, they described him as quiet, introverted, maybe even a little unsettling, and they talk about this interest he had in control, in manipulating people. Looking back now, knowing what we know, it's pretty chilling.
Oh, absolutely. These signs, right, they might have seemed small at the time, easy to dismiss, but they do point to a pattern emerging, something for us to think about, psychologically speaking, that need to be in control, the way he calculated things, the careful planning, all that becomes tragically clear later on. And, our sources mention the idea of antisocial personality disorder, but a formal diagnosis back then in Ecuador, that was unlikely.
Which brings us, sadly, to the late 1980s, early 1990s. This is when those early whispers, they turned into something truly awful. Chamba's reign of terror in Ecuador begins. We're talking a series of brutal attacks, murders, targeted at young women. And this is how he earned that terrible name, the Monster of Machala.
Yeah, and the way he operated in those days is very disturbing to think about. He would build trust with his victims, different ways of doing it, and he'd watch their routines, see when they were vulnerable, and then attack. It wasn't just impulsive, out-of-control violence. This was planned, calculated, predatory.
And one thing that's deeply concerning when you look at the information we have is that the sources point out these weaknesses in law enforcement, the local police, their ability to connect these early crimes. Ineffective policing, no real shared databases. It sounds like the system just wasn't ready for a predator like him.
Right, exactly. And tragically, what we see is that a lot of his victims were from poorer communities, and that may have meant their cases were overlooked, not given the attention they deserved. There are even reports of families being dismissed, told their daughters had run away when they went missing. This points to societal biases, systemic neglect.
Yeah, it paints a really grim picture. And it seems like his very normal appearance, the way he blended in, that played a big part in avoiding suspicion. Quiet, reserved, even polite. He probably was the last person anyone would think was capable of this violence.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how well he cultivated that image of being ordinary. Being able to blend in, not attract attention, that was key to him evading capture for so long. It makes you think about how we perceive dangerous individuals, right? They don't always fit those stereotypes we have in our head.
But finally, thankfully, in 1993, he was caught. And it was thanks to the descriptions given by the women who survived his attacks. The public was horrified, of course, by what came out, the gruesome details. And amazingly, he was quickly tried and sentenced to 16 years in prison. You'd think that would be it, wouldn't you?
Well, you'd hope so, but sadly, no. And this is where another massive breakdown in the system becomes clear. Despite the horrific nature of what he'd done, Chamba was released after just 7 years. 7 years. And this was because of sentence reductions for, get this, good behavior, which was allowed under Ecuadorian law at the time.
7 years.
Yeah.
For the monster Machala, it's almost hard to believe. And the sources, they really highlight the failure here, the automatic way this good behavior clause was applied without any real consideration for, his psychology, the danger he posed.
Exactly. It shows us a loophole in the law, maybe a focus on just getting things done quickly that completely missed the need to keep the public safe in the long term. It really makes you ask, what does good behavior even mean when we're talking about someone with this kind of violence in his past, someone who might have a serious personality disorder?
So here we are, the year 2000, and a convicted serial offender is back out on the streets. And what does he do? He leaves Ecuador, moves to Spain, Lleida, and Catalonia. And here's where the lack of international cooperation really shows its devastating consequences.
What's really striking is that he basically had a clean slate in Spain. Because of all the bureaucratic problems, legal limits on sharing criminal records, there were no streamlined international databases for this stuff. So the Spanish authorities, they had no idea about his past, his horrific crimes in Ecuador.
It's mind-boggling. He walks into a new country, pretends to be reformed, even gets a job at an educational institution, a place with vulnerable people, and no red flags just because the information wasn't there. It's a colossal failure of the system.
Yeah, it really exposes the limitations, right? National systems working on their own in a world that's so connected. No strong way to share crucial criminal information across borders. That's how Chamba erased his past, built a new fake identity.
And for almost 4 years, he lived under the radar. The sources mention these anecdotes, people saying he had an eerie presence, that he would watch women intently, making them uncomfortable. But with no information about his past, these were just whispers, nothing that would trigger an investigation.
This period is interesting because it shows how hard it is to spot potentially dangerous people based on just, subtle behaviors. Those observations, they're creepy in hindsight, but they weren't enough to get past the fact that there was no hard information about his criminal history.
And then, in December 2004, the worst thing happens. Maria Isabel Bascuñana, a 27-year-old student, disappears in Lleida after her night classes. Tragically, her body is found later, and the similarities to Chamba's crimes back in Ecuador, they were just undeniable. This is the terrible, catastrophic outcome of all those systemic failures we've been talking about.
This is what really brings it home, the human cost of these failures. Maria Isabel's death, it was a direct result of international systems failing to track, to monitor a known violent offender. It raises these huge questions about who's responsible, the need for accountability.
Absolutely. So looking back at this awful chain of events, what are the core failures that Chamba's case really throws a spotlight on?
Well, for me, the most obvious one is the lack of real cooperation internationally when it comes to tracking criminals. Someone with his history, documented violence, he just moved to another continent and vanished from the radar. That's a huge problem with the systems that were in place then.
And then you've got the weak sentencing policies, these automatic reductions, without any real psychological assessment. A one-size-fits-all approach just doesn't work for all criminals, especially those with these deeply ingrained patterns of violence.
Right. We have to think about the long-term risk these individuals pose. Release decisions, they need to be based on more than just, whether they behave themselves in prison. We need thorough psychological assessments, proper risk evaluations. Those are essential.
And another big failure is the lack of strong background checks across borders. It seems incredible that in this day and age, this crucial information wasn't easily shared between countries.
It shows the urgent need for improvement,
What?
better communication between law enforcement agencies across borders, sharing that vital data. We need secure, efficient databases internationally so authorities can see people's criminal histories no matter where those crimes happened.
And it's not just about sharing information, is it? It seems like we need stronger judicial oversight, too, to stop repeat offenders from using these legal loopholes. And the sources also talk about the importance of keeping track of high-risk individuals after they're released.
Absolutely. If someone have a history of violent crimes, especially serial offenses, we need strong monitoring supervision to protect everyone else, regular check-ins, mandatory therapy, maybe restrictions on where they can go, what they can do.
In the end, it comes down to better cooperation between countries on a judicial level, making sure past convictions aren't just forgotten when someone crosses a border.
Exactly. We need a much stronger commitment to holding people accountable for serious crimes, no matter where they are now. And that means a global effort working together to fix these big gaps in our justice systems.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the case of Gilberto Chamba, the monster of two continents, the main failures are very clear. Not enough sharing of information internationally, sentencing policies that don't properly account for psychology, and a tragic lack of real cooperation between law enforcement agencies globally. And the consequences, well, you've heard them. They were absolutely devastating.
It makes you think, doesn't it? How can we, as a global community, make sure we share information better, track dangerous individuals more effectively across borders? What are the ethics of it all, the practical challenges of building these complex systems?
It leaves you with a lot to think about. With all the complexities of international law, the different ways justice works around the world, how can we protect individual rights and also make sure we're keeping everyone safe and ultimately prevent another tragedy like the one caused by the monster of two continents? It's a question we need to keep asking, keep discussing, and most importantly, take action on.
If you enjoyed this video and want to dive deeper into more cases like this one, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to like the video if you found the story compelling, and share it with your friends and family who might be interested in true crime and mysteries. By subscribing, you'll stay up to date with all our latest content and join a growing community of curious minds exploring the most fascinating cases. Click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything.